We will begin the webinar shortly. For those who are already on, you will not only have access to this webinar in person, but they are also hosted on our website, on our YouTube channel for you to see at a later date if you'd like to revisit this. We'll get started. Good afternoon. My name is Sharon Roberson, President and CEO of the YWCA Nashville and Middle Tennessee. And thank you for joining the YWCA's Stand Against Injustice conversation. Today, our topic is Truth in the Noise, how to navigate today's fractured media landscape. Today, we will gather at a time when when the way we receive information is changing rapidly, and not always for the better. Traditional journalism is shrinking. Social media platforms reward speed and over accuracy, and misinformation too often shapes public opinion before truth has a chance to catch up. In this fractured media landscape, our communities are left navigating confusion, division, and distrust. At the YWCA, we know that justice, safety, and equity depends on informed communities. How stories are told and who gets to tell them matters deeply to this shared future. Today, we are honored to be joined by three experts who will help us explore how today's media environment affects our community spaces, our civic engagement, and our ability to understand one another. Today, together, we will offer insights into how we can become more thoughtful consumers of information and more responsible contributors to the public conversation. This discussion is not just about media and access to media. It is about strengthening our community thought through truth, accountability, and connection. And we are grateful for our sponsors, the Nissan Foundation, the Harness Foundation, and Alliance Bernstein for making this conversation possible and for their continued commitment to social justice. Now, let's begin by hearing from the brilliant voices we have today who will guide us through this terrain. I'll turn over to our expert panelists. First, I would ask for each panelist to briefly introduce themselves. I'll start with you, Mr. Ismail.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Levi Ismail. I'm an investigative reporter for News Channel 5 here in Nashville. And my work has spanned any number of different things, different issues, social issues here in the city and beyond, really. But what I've been most interested in, over the past few years is just the intersect between, putting together content on television and finding ways to broaden our horizons and get in front of as many eyeballs as possible. And so what I've been doing is trying to find ways for not only myself but for my colleagues to take our content and put it in places that typically most people would not see our type of news content, because we want to make sure that not only are not only are we meeting the eyeballs where they are, but we are also helping to inform people and make sure that they have a trusted news voice where they are typically getting their news content. And so that's me in a nutshell and what we've been up to here at News Channel 5 and what I've been up to myself.
All right, Ms. Wells.
Thank you again for having me. I'm excited and glad we're having this conversation. My name is Rachel Wells. I am the founder of TN Repro News, which is a newsletter I write about reproductive justice, reproductive health, abortion law, fertility law in Tennessee, and explain what that means to people in the real world. So what is your doctor's appointment tomorrow going to look like based on what's happening in the state capitol? And a lot of what's happening in Tennessee is rolling out across the country as well. Tennessee, Texas, a lot of the legislation here is having national impacts and implications. And so I try to make complicated policy understandable to someone who doesn't understand policy.
All right, all right. And Miss Beverly Kill, a former YWCA board member.
Hi. As Dean of the Scott Borchetta College of Media and Entertainment at MTSU, my job is to make sure all of our students feel welcomed and engaged, and we want every student to have every possible opportunity. We don't ever want to have a student turn down an opportunity for travel or internship rewards because of money. And then I'm still involved. In the music industry and a little bit in the journalism world. And I am co-founder of Change the Conversation, which works to bring about gender equality in country music and national music equality, which fights racism in the national music industry.
All right. Okay, I'll go back to you, Miss Kill, with the first question. We're living in a moment defined by information overload, and all of us have felt this. Disappearing local newsrooms and representation, and a rise of social media first. We know that many people receive most of their information from whatever social media, whether real or AI generated. From your perspective, what is the biggest shift in how people get and understand news today?
Oh, well, obviously the one of the biggest shifts is how they receive the news and what gatekeepers, if any, have run that news through an editorial process before being presented to the public. Um, Many of my students don't own a television. All right, so in my generation, we watched NBC Thursday night, TV Don't Miss. We watched Letterman every night. Now they don't watch the late night shows. They just watch clips streamed on social media the next day. I remember in like 2009, I attended a conference for editors, and they quoted a young man saying, well, if news is important enough, it will reach me. And we were all appalled by that. Like, you should want to seek out news. Well, you know what? Now that's just a commonality, right? How quickly did we hear about Rob Reiner's murders or the Brown shooting, right? Um, and not only did we hear from reporters with the Brown University shooting, but we saw cell phone video from the people in the room. So on one instance, we're all reporters now. But on the other hand, most of us haven't been trained to be journalists, so we don't know the difference between opinion and fact. We don't know ethically what you can and cannot say, and those sorts of things. So listen, it's a different world than it was when I was at the Tennessean in 2007, 2009. It's totally different in terms of journalism. I think you're muted.
Sorry, normally I never mute myself during these things. So if I did this time, and look what happens to me. No, but I was just really that was very interesting perspective. I've learned a lot just from what you've said already. What's the biggest shift in how people get and understand news? And I'm sure you've had to adjust the way that you do things based on that knowledge.
Right. I mean, our cell phones dominate our lives now. It's the first thing we look at in the morning. And then even if I learn about something for social media, then I'll go to the websites of traditional media to try
Yes.
to find out more. Now, the good thing is about the internet is that you can go to local papers. So you can go to the Providence paper to get their reporting on Brown University, or in North Carolina when they had the flooding from the hurricanes, you could go to the Asheville, North Carolina paper. So that's great. Um, but I will also do the reverse. If I see something in a traditional news outlet, then I'll go to social media to see if there's additional information. So, the thing is, our attention spans are just tiny now, right? How many times do you see a post and you're like, oh, I'm not reading all that. Well, it's a third of the length of what we used to see on in articles, right? And and even if you have a 10,000, 20,000 word piece in the New Yorker, it's still going to have little bite size taken out of it and shared on social media. So the attention span is really concerning to me.
Ms. Wells, let's go to you. You're in the business of trying to educate the public, getting the information out there. What's the biggest shift that you've seen, or how have you had to flex, so to speak, so that the news is functional for your purposes today?
Sure. So I think obviously a lot of what Beverly said is completely accurate. You know, we have really small time frames, but I think people who are consuming content, especially online, are looking for individual voices that they can trust. You know, I know a lot of mainstream newsrooms are now using their talent as the faces, and that's been happening for 2 decades. But there's also reporters, independent reporters like me, who have started their own publications and have become experts in the topics that they report from previous reporting or what have you. And so I think that there's a real shift to look at individual voices and to follow them and see that their reporting has been consistent. And I think there's a deeper trust when there's an independent reporter, um, especially if they, you know, have follow through and accountability.
Okay. All right. All right. Mr. Ismail, a person I have stalked from afar. I do watch you and see what you have to say because I said, I figure if he says at least he's read something and talked to someone and understands what we're talking about. So
That's the
let us
hope, right? What were you saying?
what do you see? The changing landscape. You really hit all the points. You do the regular news, the social media news. Tell us the
Yeah.
shift.
Well, I will say that obviously Beverly and Rachel, they hit it right on the head there as far as not only the attention spans being small, but who is who is considered a trusted news voice,
Yes.
right? And what I found is that early on when I started adopting my news stories into more conversational pieces on social media, people valued the production value. Right at first, they saw it and they thought, "Oh, there's the news guy who is creating content for us
Yeah.
here." And then eventually, I realized that my content, the production value, was getting to the point where it needed more authenticity. Like the people who were taking perhaps a story that I've done or someone else here around Nashville and just sitting in their car and talking about what was happening. They were getting far more engagement because people felt like they were authentic. Like it wasn't just someone trying to sell you a news story. It was someone who may have experienced some of this stuff themselves, or someone who is going through issues regarding childcare or the affordability or whatever it might be. Like those are real voices that are that are having these things happen around them, and they're explaining it in their own words. And I found that oftentimes we get into this mindset as far as TV news is concerned that we are the only game in town, right? Like we think that
Yeah.
that we are the end all be all when it comes to disseminating news and getting in front of as many people as possible. Well, when we were experiencing some of the protests that happened in downtown Nashville, whether it's the protests in 2020 or some of the stuff we saw during special elections or whatever, some of the voices that were getting the most attention were people who just picked up their phones and were walking around the city, telling us what was happening, and then we shared that information, and it gained a little bit more credibility, perhaps, but I think that one of the things that we are experiencing when it comes to TV news is that we're trying to find ways to make it feel more authentic so that it doesn't just go in one ear and out the other, or it doesn't just seem like we're doing the same thing just on a different platform. No, like we have to find ways to make sure that people know not only are we vetting the information that we're talking about, but we're also not trying to sell you on anything. We're just sharing what we know and hoping that you can see us as human beings at the end of the day.
Okay. All right. I'm going to follow up with you first on the next question because we do see that African American journalists and other marginalized groups, they're sort of the voices are disappearing in the major newsroom, let's say the nightly news on the major stations. What are the real world consequences? And I know that it gets very difficult because you often don't know all of the facts behind these changes. But what are the real world consequences when fewer diverse storytellers are out there?
I think first and foremost, we don't have people in the room who can tell us when things should be one way or the other. We have different life experiences, that come to the table. And that's one of the beauties of a newsroom that's diverse, is that I can ask someone who might have a shared experience with the person that we're talking about and say, hey, is this appropriate word? Is this an appropriate word to use, or is this an appropriate way to identify this person? I myself have had issues where in the past I said one thing, and then literally as soon as you are done off air, there is a tweet that flies out and someone says, he misidentified this person, or he didn't use the correct pronouns or whatever. And I'm thinking, I'm using the information that the police gave us, you know thinking that this is accurate. But, had we had more people in the newsroom, perhaps, who could have just said, hey, actually, I don't think that's accurate. Like, that's the kind of stuff that you're missing when you lose out on the diversity. And I'm not just talking about race, I'm talking about gender, I'm talking about, people of different sexual orientations, I'm talking about all of these different things. They help us to be better at what we do when we are talking about providing information to the masses. Ultimately, you want to make sure that you're not just saying something because you think it's accurate. You want to share what you know with someone who can give you real life experience, perhaps. And you're not always going to have that. But at the very least, like, if I was to ever have a newsroom or be involved in a newsroom where I can make those decisions, I'm telling everybody the first thing we're doing is making this as diverse as possible, so we don't feel like we're always the smartest people in the room.
All right, Ms. Wells, let's talk about the real world consequences of fewer diverse storytellers.
I'd love to. I think diversity in storytelling and having them be the voices leading the conversation is why we've missed a lot of what's happening, and we've been behind in a lot of news, and looking back to say, oh, we saw this pattern coming, when other groups of people have been living the pattern for decades already. And I particularly in my field in reproductive rights, there's a lot that has been reported on post Roe v. Wade falling, and the reproductive justice movement has been calling attention to it for years and years and years. And of course, it's those who are marginalized by race, by their gender identity, by their income, and they're the first ones impacted when laws and policies change. And I think if we don't put those voices first, we're missing the point, and we're going to continue to be behind the curve. And so in my work, it's been very important. Obviously, I am not someone that is at the intersection of those identities, but those are the people I seek out first when I see a policy coming down, when I see legislation being debated. I'm going to the people who I know are marginalized and seeing how has this been affected, and also listening to those voices today, not just when it's convenient based on the stories that are popular, but watching what those organizations, watching what those people are doing and what they're trying to get out there, because the media does not typically go to them first. They go to the most prominent voices, and those positions of power are not those marginalized voices, obviously. So it matters a lot in the reporting, and I think the truth of how it's going to impact people on the ground.
Yeah, that's very important. I know it's like so many things. Some in our work, especially in the domestic violence space, I often say, what do the people say they need? And it's that simple, because we can sit around and think tanks and then classrooms and talk about something all day, but that's not the same thing as the lived experience of someone that you're trying to support or help. Okay, Ms. Kill, tell me about this real world consequences of fewer diverse storytellers.
Well, history has left out so many voices of women, of people of color, of LGBTQ, of lower socioeconomic status. I mean, obviously, it's been the powerful that have controlled everything, the creation of history, the narrative. And so we need to make sure the entire story is told, the entire truth is told. Um, you don't know what you don't know. Most people don't think that they are. Most people, journalists try to do a good job. They want to write the best story and have it published first or aired first. Most don't have the agendas that people think they do, right? They're competitive, they want to do a good job, but you don't know what you don't know. So you're only hearing half the story. You're talking to your sources, and they all have, their own perspective or agenda. I think that's why it's so important that we all support um, African American owned publications like Tennessee Tribune, who are a great voice of the community. I did love Rosetta Miller Perry. Can't say enough about her because, um, she represents a community that would otherwise be ignored with mainstream media. And you can say the same with LGBTQ media outlets, women owned. I think the poor are so forgotten in everyday coverage. Um, we report on the Jeff Bezos and the Mark Zuckerbergs and their every move and what their wives wear and all this. But, we don't see a lot of reporting about, what is it like to be a police officer and a nurse raising a family of 3 kids in Nashville. Affordability is now a buzzword. Well, let's talk to the people that are making a living as opposed to just the politicians. So you have to know um, what you don't know, and listen, you have to get out, you have to get on the streets, you have to do the shoe leather, as they say. You got to meet people, and then you know what you have to do? Listen. Don't try to impress them and tell them what you think is the story. Just listen. I've learned so much through Nashville Music Equality uh, from just listening. Like I'm embarrassed by my ignorance in those areas, really. And I think back to things I might have said or done, but it's all about listening and learning. As Oprah says, Maya Angelou says, when you know better, you do better. So it's all about just trying to be fair and accurate for everybody.
All right, Mr. Ismail, authority and trust. There was hopefully everyone on this call has heard of Walter Cronkite. When I was growing up, whatever Walter Cronkite said, hopefully he didn't go bad because anything he said was the absolute fact, the absolute truth. You could trust it. It had been vetted. It was absolutely what we needed to believe is truthful. And so often reporters and figures on television are viewed as trusted figures in the community, as you are. How has the erosion of local newsrooms and the rise of algorithms, because everyone says the algorithm says you should say this, the algorithm says you should do that. I want to know how we got to this point. But with that said, those platforms, how have they changed the way audiences decide who to believe? We no longer have Walter Cronkite. We have Mr. Algorithm.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think that, uh, building credibility is one of the toughest things that we are trying to do right now when it comes to, television news, because for the longest time, we've, just like you mentioned, the erosion of that person, that trusted news voice, that person who you can always count on to be as knowledgeable about the subject as possible. But even Mr. Cronkite, he had his own issues at one point or another, and he had to battle trying to get that credibility back. This is one of the things that I try to make sure I do is, just help people understand that I'm not the expert in everything, right? That would be impossible for you to cover every story and try to be the expert. I mean, I think it just goes back to what Beverly said about listening and trying to make sure that you understand that you are helping people get their story out there. And so when I'm putting together a story for whether it's on air or on digital, on the algorithms, if you will, like I make it clear I am learning in a lot of this, and I am a way for people to help get their voice out there. And so it helps with it. Ironically enough, that helps with my credibility because people then know I'm not trying to convince them of something that I don't know all that much about. Like if I was to cover us, like, I've covered a number of stories on domestic violence. Okay. I am not an expert on domestic violence. I am someone who has done a number of different stories on this subject and have talked to a number of different people who have been impacted. I want them to tell their story. I want them to come forward. And if there are any issues that really resonate with people, I want them to feel comfortable coming to me and saying, "Yeah, Levi, can I have the opportunity to say my piece?" And yes, we will vet all types of information, and if there's data next to it, then we'll vet that as well. People can trust that I know how to get that information vetted. But as far as someone's life experience, I want them to share that information. And me just being able to say, listen, I don't know everything, but I will do my best to learn about it and help share that information with you on all these different platforms. That goes a long way for a lot of people. Sure, the algorithms, they prioritize people just speaking as if it's fact, but that's just because it's for a lot of people it's entertaining. They want that person who is going to say this is exactly what happened, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but this is how it should be. Like, those folks are going to get a lot more attention than your typical journalist who is just trying to do their job and do it well. Those folks are going to get that attention. So yes, you're always battling this algorithm that is prioritizing sensationalism and the clickbait and the headlines or whatever. But that doesn't mean that there's not an appetite for real news, real information by real people.
Definitely. Okay. Ms. Wells, you're an independent journalist and you created Tennessee Repro Pro News to fill a void. And I'm assuming that's because there was something missing in the more mainstream news. Tell me a little bit about how your journalism works and in the era, of course, when we have the algorithms that prioritize over really deep research.
Sure. Well, like I mentioned earlier, I am focused on one area. I'm not covering all of the news like a traditional newsroom would. I'm covering just reproductive health news and policy and in Tennessee. I do have some coverage that goes into the national impact because there are trends across the nation. There is legislation that's written by lobbyists and then disseminated out to the state lobbyists and then pushed through the legislature. So there is a lot of connection nationally to what I do. But I will say it is much harder to establish credibility without having the name of a newsroom. I was a freelance journalist before I launched this Substack. I've been covering this topic for more than a decade now. And the reason I started this Substack was because a lot of my editors, whom I love and respect and are in great newsrooms, can't give it the context and the depth it deserves for a variety of reasons. They're covering a lot of other news. They don't have subject matter experts. They're nonprofits, a lot of them. And funding is a real challenge, when everyone is asking for money and the news industry has changed entirely. like Levi's trying to find how content feels right on all these different platforms. So reporters and journalists are being spread a lot more than just focusing on reporting a story. But I think the consistency and the longevity and the way that I report future impacts of this legislation gives me a lot more credibility than hopping on TikTok and going, alarm, 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 this is outrageous, which is what a lot of the content creators do, whether they're journalists or people, on the street, frankly. But I think being able to take the news and get sources that it's really impacting, go into towns, have individuals trust you when everything is so competitive and also, high risk. A lot of my sources now don't want to be on the record. And so that's something that's challenging for me. I follow, my work as a journalist very, respectfully. And I get a lot of pushback as an independent journalist on this wasn't vetted and this person, is obviously made up. And I'm a journalist. I'm not a person on the street, So I think the longevity, like I said, and sticking with the stories and pulling them through to the future is how, at least in my world, I generate credibility.
All right. All right, Miss Kill, you are training young minds in this field, and these are often individuals that all they know is the quick journalism
Right,
or the quick
right.
fix. Uh, Tell me a little bit about what skills do you believe are most essential for these students in entering this fractured media landscape?
Well, the quick answer is we want to teach them to think critically and communicate effectively. Some of the um, foundation of journalism remains the same since the beginning of journalism, right? You have to gather your facts. You have to talk to everybody involved. You have to present that in a clear, concise manner. And keep in mind, reporting and writing are two separate skill sets. So you have to teach them how to report and you have to teach them how to write or edit video. Also, they all have to be multimedia journalists now. So they all have to be able to post on the website or in print. They have to be able to create videos. They have to know how to use social media. Now they even have to create brands for themselves. Um, they're entering journalism at a time where journalism is really under attack. Now if you don't like facts presented, you just say fake news, right? So how do we instill confidence and dedication in our students to um, do their work even when they're under attack? A lot of people say journalism is a calling, which I have felt in my life. It's not, it's not an easy job. Usually the pay's not great, the hours stink. You're working Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, New Year's Eve. Um, the TV reporters have to go out and stand in hurricanes or tornadoes or, so, but I will tell you the enthusiasm I see from my students every day makes me so happy. They had the same calling that we did and Walter Cronkite did, and they want to tell the truth and they want to tell everybody stories. And so we want to give them the opportunities to do that. And one of the things we have to do is what we say hands-on real-world opportunities. Obviously, the 100th story you write is better than your 10th. So we had election night, live election night coverage, print and broadcast during the presidential election and local races. So we send them into communities and they have to just insert themselves and report. This winter, we have students going to small media outlets across the state to report, thanks to a grant. So it's an exciting time to be a journalist, and it's a scary time to be a journalist.
All right, Mr. Ismail. Now, this is something that I struggle with. I'm a lawyer, so I'm so used to before you say anything, you gather every possible fact, look at every issue. In my corporate life, you had to do that because misinformation had very negative consequences. that to me has been a substantial shift. And often you do investigative work. And so you do a story and follow up. But there are media sources, for instance, just the media source, nothing's wrong with it, I suppose. TMZ will have a story so quick that by the time the other media sources or anyone else hits the story, that's where people tell me, I go to TMZ, I know I'll get all the facts. I said they couldn't possibly have all the facts in such a short period of time. How do you balance this sense of urgency with making sure you know the facts or have gathered as many facts as possible in an environment where misinformation spreads and everyone thinks that they know what happened immediately?
No, that's a great question. I will say before I answer, Beverly, you kind of triggered my PTSD there from early TV days. I mean, the pay was not great, the holiday hours were terrible, and yes, you were standing in the middle of a hurricane saying, "By the way, did you know it was raining?" A lot of that was going on back then. But to answer your question, I do think that it is a balancing act. Obviously, everyone, just like Beverly mentioned, you at the very beginning of what you said was, you want to make sure that you are, you know, teaching students to not only produce the content, but do so with ethics and understanding. Like, this is information that, yes, you want to get out there as fast as possible, but you also want to understand, what it is that you're sharing. Um, this is something that, as someone who works in the TV field and has been doing a lot of stuff with digital, we're constantly balancing. I do a lot of investigative stories, just like you mentioned. But I also had to realize at one point, before I even got the digital perspective into play, I had to take a lot of base hits, you know, not necessarily swinging for the fences every single time, trying to get the home run or the grand slam. And now, before I have an opportunity to share the story that I've been working on for 6, 7 months or whatever, someone else has already put out 6 or 7 updates in that time frame, right? And so you have to balance all of that. And so the thing that I had to understand was like, yeah, you can take the base hits, you can share a little bit of information about this recent update that just happened. And I found that the same thing applies for digital. You want to get this thing out there as fast as possible, but we this is how the communities are built, and you establish a brand. I can establish a brand that says, don't worry about me putting that story out there in the first 5 minutes of it happening. It's fine. Believe me, you're going to hear about it everywhere else. Okay. And you're going to hear TMZ sending you, all sorts of information or whatever. When you get to me and you follow my page, we're going to talk about what all this means. And it may be tonight, it may be tomorrow morning, it may be in a week from now when we finally got all the information and whatnot. There are stories where, yeah, if there was the bombing that happened, not too far from, well, I shouldn't say bombing. There was the explosion that happened with bombing materials not too far from us here in Nashville. A lot of people lost their lives. I can hop on, I can hop on my camera and just shoot something to let people know, okay, yes, this happened. Here's what we know right now. And we're still gathering more information. That's the important part. I'm letting them know this is not over. I don't have all the facts. We're still digging into everything that's happening. I can put that video out in the morning and then put something on TV later that evening, come back the following day and say, okay, so here's what what we now know. That is how I balance it all out. And, people, I've yet to see in the comments of my videos or anything like that, someone saying, well, I wish Levi would have gotten this out 5 hours earlier, because this is not it actually works out in my favor that you're going to get this information, some of the information regardless, from all the different places that you pull this stuff from anyway. It's just when you come to me or when I come to you and you see me on your page, okay, we're going to talk about this, and it's going to be information that, one, has been vetted, but two, it does not have a slant or an agenda one way or another. We're just talking the same way we've talked before, in the same way we've built a rapport in the past.
And some of that comes from being a good reporter, right? So
Yeah,
if you are good at your beat, um, hopefully you have access to that information quickly. You know who to call. You have their cell phone numbers. Because they trust you, they will return your call. Because of your knowledge in covering that beat, you know what it means and why it's important. Uh, I'm not sure if TMZ pays people or not. It is difficult to
I'm sure
compete
they do.
it's difficult to compete with organizations that pay. The tabloids used to do that. So they would pay hospital clerks and the limo drivers and that kind of thing. But again, those are also the people you want to have contacts with,
Yeah,
so
that's true.
limo drivers, because again, your sources aren't just at the top running the company, they're everybody. Um, but I will tell you that pressure to publish or broadcast is among the strongest pressure journalists feel. And it often comes from inside the newsroom. Like the editors are saying, widen it up, widen it up. Channel 2 has it, widen it up. So that's really difficult. And it used to be we'd have one or two deadlines a day, right? There would be the 6 and 10 o'clock news or the city edition of a newspaper and the final edition. Well, now your deadline's every single minute of every single day. And then after you post, then they want you to update it because we need more clicks. So that's one of the hardest things of being a journalist now.
And I'll go to you, Ms. Wells, and this is something that I had a startling experience with. There are often narratives that are placed out in the media, and the narrative should maintain a status quo. And some people very close to me are putting out a certain narrative. I had a conversation with someone that was really living in a community that was being portrayed in a certain way, and she had a totally different perspective, which wasn't in line with the whole media image. What stories do you see being silenced or misrepresented right now, and what makes it possible to tell them outside the traditional outlets?
Exactly. It's a major problem. And I hear that all the time from sources. I have people that I'm in consistent touch with. And like I mentioned earlier, people will swoop in when there's a big story. Like, for example, I wrote something about a woman who was denied prenatal care because she was unmarried. And that wasn't legally challenged yet because she's trying to continue her life and be pregnant. But national media came in, jumped at her, and she said, I don't want to be a part of this story because I know in a week you won't be here paying attention to what's happening. She, and I think this is what illustrates it. She's talking about in her community, this happens all the time. People are turned away, whether it's race or it's judgment or it's maybe their inability to pay or their inability to come to consistent appointments, in the healthcare space that I'm in. And so they say, you know what, you're not the best fit for my practice. And that's not just happening once in a while, it's happening all the time. And so I think similar to not having diverse voices in traditional media as much as, you know, there could be, it's that you're missing these stories on a systemic basis. And that again goes back to the reproductive justice conversations, which is, oh my God, Roe v. Wade isn't here. How are we going to access abortion when the communities, particularly in the South, who are poor and maybe immigrant communities, hadn't been able to access it already? So it can be really frustrating to see the media narrative is now this is an emergency, we're on fire, where communities have been begging for attention, like we've been on fire, we're burnt out already. So it is really frustrating. And I think it's why it's so important to stay in touch with those sources day to day and check in and get that gut check, not just when there's something really big and then you kind of go in from there. I think it's what you said, Beverly. It's listening all the time to see the trends and the problems and the disconnect. And fortunately, I have the privilege and the ability to do that and set my own agenda because I don't have an editor. I am my editor. And so I have a lot more opportunity to do that with my reporting now than I did working for newsrooms.
All right. I'll go to you, Miss Kill. We always in these conversations like give our audiences nuggets of help because the reason that they wanted to listen to this conversation is they wanted to be better. They wanted to do better. And what what are practical steps that individuals can take to navigate this information? Because I know it's very frustrating. There was a story that came out even yesterday that was absolute fact, but a number of people said that was fake until it really became obvious it was fact. So what can someone do? Should everyone just wait till they have their three credible sources or one credible source? What should they do to be a better consumer of media information?
Well, first I would say don't add to the problem. So don't jump on social media and trash everything and everybody. If you offer your opinion, offer it without calling somebody a name, right? Just say, well, I disagree with this and here's why. It's going to take extra time to find trusted sources. Um, Now, Substack is a great place to find veteran journalists and trusted voices. The downside is it can cost you a little extra money, but they know what they're doing. Like Rachel knows her stuff better than anybody else who's reporting on it. So, um, there's a woman I like, Stacey Patton. I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she is just brilliant and bold and fearless, and I read everything. Heather Richardson, is that the name of the historian that everybody follows online? That she's spectacular. Her whole life is now spent on telling us what happens and how it relates to history and what are the laws and all that. So um, don't become a part of the problem. Tune out some of the noise and seek out trusted sources of information.
All right, Mr. Ismail, what advice can you give to our audience, practical steps they can take to navigate, which to me, even on a daily basis, are very treacherous waters?
Kind of to dovetail off of what Beverly said, it is important to make sure that you are seeking out these people, the folks that, you just from reading their information, just from reading their stories, it's pretty obvious. You can tell that there's a lot of thought and a lot of work that goes into it. There's a lot of research that goes into it. I think it's important that, we, like you said, don't add to the problem. But we're consuming this media every single day. It shouldn't
Mhm.
take much more effort to say, you know what, instead of just taking this one article and basing my opinion off of this one thing, check out the others, see what the others have to say. And also, don't listen to anyone who's telling you that there's no other way, right? Like there are people out there that will say, this is the information, I'm right, and that's it. And I don't think that's fair. I think we should be good stewards of the information that is provided to us, and say, you know what, before I hop on to the camera and just let her rip with all I have to say about this, I'm going to seek out other news sources. They may be traditional news. They may be the local journalist that's shooting video or putting together a Substack or whatever, or it may just be someone I saw on TikTok that happened to go to the city council meeting and shared how they felt. Like we can absolutely incorporate all of those opinions and all of the stories that we're hearing out there and form our own judgment based off of that. But I one of the toughest things that I think we deal with all the time now is that the folks who have been trusted for a very long time are having a tough time realizing they may not
Mhm.
have the power they once had before. And that's an ego check. When you thought that you were the only game in town, and now Joe Schmo is in their car and they got 20,000 more views than you did, and you're going, but I'm the guy who knows this stuff. I'm the guy who's on TV. I'm the guy who does XYZ. Like, yeah, great. That's amazing for you. But oftentimes people are more likely to listen to someone who doesn't sound like they're trying to sell you news. Um, Now, all that to say, I do think it's even just as important that we as journalists are in those spaces. So when someone is seeking out credible news sources, they don't have to look that far for us. They don't have to just go to our website, or they don't have to just wait for the 6 o'clock, 5 o'clock news or whatever. Like, we have to be there. And the perfect example is just some of the like what we mentioned with the Brown University, for example, the shooting that happened out there. People are looking for this information as soon as possible, and where do they turn? They turn to social media, and they're
Yeah.
finding the videos of people who are sitting in their classrooms, and they're listening to the stories of students who were there that day. They're not going to wait for anything anymore. So I think it's important that there are quality, trusted journalists, or there. I should say it this way: I believe that it's important that the journalists who are willing to put in the work are also in the spaces where people want to be informed. That it's no longer just the dancing videos and funny cat videos or whatever. Like, there is an appetite out there for all of the information, for the incredible journalists, and people like Rachel, who's doing this independent journalism. Like, there's an appetite for finding out this information and understanding what's happening in our communities.
Right. Ms. Wells, tell us what we can offer our audience about navigating these difficult waters.
I mean, you guys have nailed it too. So I think, obviously all of that is right, but mostly I think it's important to look at the bigger picture, the framework, who is telling these stories and why. And you can apply that to traditional news sites, you can apply that to TikTok. I mean, it takes one more click. And at this point, everyone thinks they're an investigative reporter, right? And they can get their Instagram story up first and be the one who, broke it, whether they did or not. So I think looking at that, whoever comes up first on your feed, question why they're there first. Was it because they were at the shooting and they're a student who has the raw footage and they're talking about it? Or are they a conservative, news outlet who is looking for, a more outrage kind of virality moment? And so we talk about, oh, that's asking a lot more of news consumers, but I do think at this time we do need to ask more. The First Amendment is under direct attack, and journalists who present themselves as journalists may not be journalists. They may be lobbyists, and so I think it's critical that you look at who's putting out the information, and like Beverly and Levi said, going and checking other publications and seeing what is very left, what is very right, what is in the middle, who is funded by a lobbyist, who is an independent journalist, what is their previous work. Tell me about who this journalist is. So it does require extra legwork, but that is how you will find the truth and the middle. And like I said, I know it's asking a lot, but I think if we want to keep our democracy and our First Amendment and support real journalism, you are going to have to do that extra legwork.
Yes, I would agree. We always like to end these conversations with hope, and I know that each of you are going to keep doing what you're doing, at least in the near future. So there has to be passion there. But I'll start with you, Ms. Kill. There's a lot of future in journalism. I don't know if we'll ever get beyond the fake news world that we're in. And, everyone, if you don't like it, is fake news. If you like it, even if it is fake news, you say it's not. But what can we do for the future of journalism collectively? How can we build back this trust?
First of all, we need to recognize the value in journalism and the importance of journalism to our democracy, to our country. We need to support journalists. You know, we need to pay for some subscriptions
Yeah.
so that they can work. I mean, if you look at the size of newsrooms now, they've just been decimated. That's why I try not to publicly criticize the journalists because I'm thinking they're doing the job of three people. They're doing the best they can, right? They've laid off copy editors. So now there's nobody to proof the copy before it's posted. So, you know, you've got to support journalism. And I think there are, you know, more good people than bad in the world. I think there's more good journalists than bad in the world. And we have to keep fighting for the truth. We have to keep fighting because if we surrender, then that means we've lost democracy. So we don't have a choice but to keep fighting. And you know, I would love for you all to fund some journalism scholarships or donate to our journalism program. But supporting journalism through paid subscriptions, watch your viewership, that makes a big difference.
Yeah, I understood. Mr. Ismail, and I hope that everyone understands that you have become this trusted source in our media outlets. So that's very important. And so that to me speaks to the future of positivity in journalism in our community. But what can we do to rebuild this trust?
I will say it's a responsibility that I
Yes,
don't take for granted. Um, I think that part of it is, as far as rebuilding trust, we have to be critical thinkers and look at where we're getting our information from.
mhm,
Because I think for the longest time, we were, very comfortable with knowing that if it was said by the DOJ, or if it was said by the FBI,
yeah,
or if it was said by DHS, DCS, whoever, then yeah, I mean that's who we're citing, and that's the information that's going to be put on TV and wherever. Now we are in a position where we have to think very critically about what is the agenda behind all of this. And the perfect example is what we saw just what was it earlier this week, when, well, what is it, it's Tuesday, just yesterday I think it was, when we saw the headline read FBI, arrests for in California over, foiled terrorist plot. And the first thing that came to my mind was, oh, that sounds great. I mean, congratulations. We got some, we stopped a New Year's Eve terrorist attack. And then you listen to the press conference and it's, we arrested left wing terrorists. And I'm going, okay, that if someone did not listen to this press conference or someone did not pay more close attention to what's actually being said, they may just think that the only reason this was done was to get those people off the streets, like the terrorist group off the streets. There's context, there's information that needs to be
yes,
involved in what we are doing. And we can't just take one headline or one press release that we're getting from what we thought were once the end all be all when it comes to information that was not going to be tainted by one administration or another. We are responsible for the information that we are sharing. And I think that that is something that we need to take more ownership over it. But also, I think this is kind of a great learning experiment. It's a great learning experience for us to just say, okay, as a trusted news voice in our community, am I really just taking everyone's information and calling it fact? you know and for the longest time, I think many people were were guilty of doing that. But I think this is a great opportunity right now for not only the traditional news journalists, but the people who are picking up the phone for the first time and realizing that the term journalist exists. Before, they were just shooting videos of themselves sharing what they think about what's happening, and they may pull a
yes,
fact here or a fact there. And now they're going, wait, I think I could be a journalist, and I might actually be interested in learning more about this. I might actually be interested in attending MTSU, or taking a class here or there, or checking out a local newsroom because I have the grant that's available to me now. Like that kind of stuff is happening because we are realizing there's an appetite out there for being an informed news consumer. We're not like, people right now are not just going to take whatever you give them and call it fact anymore. I think we are more likely to seek out sources, seek out information, and that is giving me hope, because now I know that you're not just going to, like, sure, there's a lot of people out there that have a lot of opinions, but you're holding me to a higher standard. And I appreciate that. And I also appreciate the young folks who are like they know the thing that I'm trying to teach other traditional journalists to do. They've known it. That's all they've known. And now they're coming into the, into the fold, and they're becoming the experts the moment they start their first gig. That's incredible. This is that gives me hope that we're on the right track here, and there's really no looking back.
All right, Ms. Wells, very briefly, give us just one positive nugget.
I mentioned this story earlier about a woman who was denied prenatal care, and I had
Yes.
very little I could do to validate her identity because of her physical safety. And I did as much as possible. And national news picked it up because they trust me as an independent reporter. But my positive note is that I heard feedback from people across the country of all different political stripes who made a point to say, I'm in deep red Oklahoma, or I vote Republican in Tennessee, or I'm a devout Christian, and this is not what my religion means. So I think people, to Levi's point, people are looking for real information. They are looking for truth. They are not looking for, narratives that match their beliefs. And I'm happy to be a trusted voice that people of differing views can still come to and feel like they're getting facts. So I do think that's a positive indicator of people's commitment to fact and to journalism and our First Amendment.
Well, this has been fantastic. Thanks, the three of you, for really bringing what we envisioned this conversation would be like. And we thank you so much. We're hopeful that our audience appreciates the time that you took. Thank you for your time, but more importantly, thank you for your passion for the work that you do every day.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
This was great.
Bye.
Thank you guys so much.